The Giving membership is the complete spiritual growth package. For less than $30 per year, you'll get incredible perks from Giving Company's family of brands, including 5 free movie rentals every month from Christian Cinema and discounts on Christian books. Plus, Giving members have the privilege of partnering with World Vision to help end the global water crisis. Become a Giving member today at givingcompany.com/giving membership and start experiencing more fruitful living. The other side of the road is safe, where we sidestep being bothered and avoid getting involved. But rolling up your sleeves and boldly going where few dare to tread, that's walking through Samaria. Each week on our podcast, we introduce you to the special few who walk in the spirit of the Good Samaritan. On behalf of the Giving Company and your hosts, David Hendrickson and Dan Riveros, welcome to the Walking Through Samaria podcast. Hey everybody, welcome to the Walking Through Samaria podcast. I'm your host, Dan Riveros, with my co-host,
David Hendrickson.
What's up, man?
Hey, how are you?
I'm good, man.
Welcome to the office.
In office.
This is our first week where people have to be in the office. That's kind of the new rule around Giving Company, Dan. You got to be here Monday through Wednesday, and then Thursday and Friday people work remotely. That's our new thing.
How's the temperature feeling on that?
I think it's good. I think it's good. Even candidate employees that we're interviewing, they're like, I just want to be with people. Tell me that you're with people.
Yeah.
Like Monday through Wednesday. But then after that, not so much.
Cool.
How are you doing?
I'm doing good, man.
Yeah?
I've been busy just running around, got a bunch of freelance stuff and working late nights, so it's been cool. Yeah.
Dan, if our listeners don't remember, is one of our COVID survivors.
Heavy COVID survivor.
How long has it been since you had it?
I got it, it was probably like February, I think, that I had it.
Really?
Yeah.
It's been a while.
It's been a while. Yeah.
So my daughter has a blood disorder, so she didn't get cleared from her. I'm going to ask our unnamed guest, Scottish Rite, right? Is our children's hospital in Atlanta?
Children's Hospital, yeah.
Yeah. Well, yeah.
Children's Hospital.
Yeah. So Scottish Rite is where my daughter's blood disorder gets managed, and they cleared her maybe a month ago. So she signed up to get vaccinated. She goes to Georgia. She's getting paid. Like, she gets a check tomorrow when she gets her second shot.
Yeah.
As an incentive by the University of Georgia or maybe the law school.
A lot of companies have been doing
to
that.
get vaccinated.
Yeah. Interesting times. $200.
There you go.
You can also go to Music Midtown and get a shot. You get free entrance into the big festival.
Are you serious?
Yeah, if you get the vaccine.
How about that?
I need to remind my 19-year-old son who's at Georgia, who's vaccinated. Maybe he needs.
Which is such an incredible story, which I can't wait to talk to you about. Because anyway, that's
So who do we got, David?
So the voice that our listeners have heard here is none other than the Lieutenant Governor of the state of Georgia, Geoff Duncan. Geoff, welcome.
Great to be here.
To the Walking Through Samaria podcast.
I think I'm happy to be here. We'll have to wait and see how I survive the gauntlet, right?
We're gonna have some fun with this conversation from a number of angles. So to our listeners, I want to read Geoff's bio, and don't leave us, because we have committed to you to be an apolitical podcast. Frankly, the reason this is called the Walking Through Samaria podcast is because we're highlighting the fact that the parable in Luke chapter 10 put a Jewish man and a Samaritan together in the story. And at the time, there was probably no greater political divide than Jews and Samaritans, at least in Scripture. So don't leave us. We're going to have really great conversations with Geoff about his new book and, frankly, his perspective on politics. So we're going to ease into this. Geoff, I'm going to read our listeners your bio, and we're going to go from there. So Geoff is a former professional baseball player and successful entrepreneur. He was elected Georgia's lieutenant governor in November of 2018. Geoff graduated from Chattahoochee High School right here in Alpharetta, where he met his wife, Brooke. Geoff and Brooke both attended the Georgia Institute of Technology, known as Georgia Tech, for those of us around here, where Geoff was a scholarship pitcher. After a successful career at Georgia Tech, Geoff was drafted by the Florida Marlins organization. Geoff spent 6 seasons playing baseball in the minor leagues, advancing as high as AAA before a shoulder injury forced his retirement in the early 2000s. After retiring from baseball, Geoff and his wife Brooke started a small marketing firm in their living room. The company experienced tremendous success, which allowed Geoff and Brooke to sell the business and move on to multiple other entrepreneurial ventures. Geoff also served as the CEO of a health technology startup. Geoff's faith inspired him to a life of leadership and prompted his upstart run for political office. He was elected to the Georgia House of Representatives in 2012. During his time in office, he authored several important pieces of legislation, including HB 749, the Cargo Theft Act, HB 152, Michael's Law, and SB 258, the Rural Hospital Tax Credit. Geoff and Brooke have been married for 23, soon to be 24 years, have 3 sons, Parker 19, Baylor 15, and Ryder, who is 11. Geoff has coached 23?
I think it's probably more than that.
Probably more than that now.
I just stopped counting at
Different
23.
youth sports teams, and also leads a weekly Bible study with his wife, Brooke. The Duncans attend Brownsbridge Community Church, which is an affiliate of North Point Community Church, which is right around the corner from our headquarters here. Geoff, that's a lot, and there's a lot more that isn't mentioned in your bio. It's a thrill to have you on the Walking Through Samaria podcast.
Great to be
Welcome,
here,
man.
and felt like a trip down memory lane there.
Yeah, how about
Listen,
that?
46 years wrapped up in 3 paragraphs.
We need to thank Brooke, right?
Yeah.
Who's the reason for Geoff's success. So we need to make sure that is
Absolutely. In
that
more
is
ways than
mentioned
one.
before we get into this.
So Marlins, you were in Miami for a while?
Well, I wish I was. I spent 6 seasons in the minor leagues wishing to be in Miami.
Okay.
But instead, I got to spend tours of duty in Utica, New York, Kane County, Illinois, Brevard County, Florida, Portland, Maine, Phoenix, Arizona, and Calgary, Canada.
Okay.
That's called the minor league life.
Any standout cities?
Loved Portland. Portland, Maine was fantastic, and certainly loved Phoenix was fun in Scottsdale. Calgary was awesome if you weren't playing baseball. It was so cold.
Oh yeah.
It was like June and July. You had sleeves and jackets
For
on.
sure.
And I was the closer. So I'd sit on ice for eight innings, and then they're like, "You got the next batter." And I was just wanted to make sure I could feel my fingertips.
No.
Oh my gosh.
Cool, man.
Well, we talk a lot on this podcast about how people just seem to always be connected somehow. One of our connections is the Kane County Cougars. So I have been to that little stadium in Illinois. I used to live in Naperville. I think my daughter's first run around the bases experience was at a Kane County Cougars game.
Yeah, so I also lived in Naperville, as I talk about in the book. Spent some time at Naperville North High School, and I grew up sitting in those stands watching those guys play, and thinking that if I could just get there, my life would be complete. And then once I got there, I'm like, I can't wait to get out of low A ball and move up. We used to joke in the Kane County games. It was really one of the first minor league stadiums that embraced the
People go picnic there.
Yeah.
Like it was a blast living
complete
in Naperville,
entertainment.
Illinois.
And as a player, we used to say, between innings, we actually play baseball around here because it was all centered around making 10,000 people, laugh in their seats between innings with, somebody chasing somebody or something coming out of the sky. But it was a fantastic place to call home for 6 months.
That's awesome.
So you knew pretty early baseball was the...
Yeah, baseball or sports in general was a huge shaping part of my life. And we lived in 7 states growing up, and every 2 years, Dad came home and said, "Hey, it's time to move." And my connection was being the best athlete on the field when I went to a new school. So when I finally settled in, it was football and baseball. I got to, finally moved here to Alpharetta my senior year in high school, and baseball took off. And it certainly felt like the vehicle for my next step.
Cool.
Good stuff. Well, you probably entered political life as a relative unknown. You kind of talk about that in the book a little bit. How
That's probably even an understatement.
It was an Andy Stanley sermon that caused you or prompted you to run for state office. For better or for worse, you're probably not an unknown anymore in the political circles. I would imagine many of our listeners have heard of Geoff Duncan, the lieutenant governor of Georgia, and kind of Georgia was on the map, around the presidential election and the Senate runoff elections, as you talk about in the book. To our listeners, if you know Geoff Duncan, the lieutenant governor of Georgia, you'll know that he's a Republican, and in the book talks about his reasons for being a conservative and private sector versus public sector from a sustainability, productivity, innovation standpoint. But I want to, Geoff, have you help me clarify a few things about your kind of policy positions, because frankly, in today's day and age, people are going to tune out, right? They're going to hear Republican and they're going to go, forget it. I'm on the other side. I'm tuning them out. They're going to hear Democrat and they're going to go, forget it. I'm on the other side. I'm tuning it out. We can't tune this stuff out because this is pretty compelling. So I want you to give me a yes or no on these following statements. And I do want to also remind our listeners, Dan and I have talked a lot about gang intervention on this podcast. We've talked a lot about Father Greg Boyle and the work that he's done in Southern California through Homeboy Industries. We have extended an invitation to Asia Brown, who I think is still the mayor of Compton, but she was at least the mayor of Compton. I think she decided to run for state office as well. But she is a Democrat, and she has done some incredible work with gang intervention in the city of Compton. So this actually isn't the first time we've wanted a politician on the podcast, but Geoff was just gracious enough to say yes when we asked. So here we go. People aren't going to believe this when I start rolling through these things, but these are pretty awesome. Georgia was one of 4 states that did not have hate crimes legislation. And you helped pass the hate crimes bill here in Georgia after speaking directly to the mother of Ahmaud Arbery.
Yes.
That's a yes. Did you hear that, listeners? That's a yes. Here's a beauty. You helped pass legalizing cannabis for medical purposes after speaking to the mother of her daughter, about her daughter, speaking to a mother about her daughter. She suffered from chronic seizures, had as many as 200 seizures a day.
Yes, and unfortunately, Kendall lost her battle with those seizures a few years after that.
You mentioned that in the book. It's really sad. You co-sponsored legislation for solar power in Georgia for residences and small businesses. You actually got solar lobbyists and utility lobbyists to get along.
Yes, and I think it passed unanimously in both the House and Senate. If not, it was only 1 or 2 votes. No.
You sponsored a bill to improve rural health care in Georgia by getting public and private interests to align around that cause.
Yes.
You are against the death penalty.
Yes.
You believe that those who come to the country illegally and who are contributing tax-paying members of communities deserve a path to permanent residence and or citizenship.
Yes.
You believe the electoral count in Georgia for President Biden was fair and square.
Yes.
Okay. So, Dan, I feel like that is our whole statement of what we've been trying to do on this podcast, which is getting people to realize that as you start to learn, as you start to listen, as you start to lean into people, the narrative, whether it's a political narrative, a media narrative, a religious narrative, like it just isn't holding up. And there's more to the story, which is what we learn from the parable in Luke chapter 10.
Yeah, and I think you have to be intentional, right? That parable that you mentioned, it was an intentional act, right? It wasn't just accidental, like things lined up and everybody made money, so therefore we were friends. Or everybody got their way, so therefore we ended up shaking hands and making up. Being intentional to reach across divides. Divides happen in our own homes, in our marriages, with our kids, with our neighbors, and certainly in politics. And so, for me, this journey, GOP 2.0 is the most partisan thing in the book. And I struggled with it. I wanted to find a different title so that nobody would look at it and think that there was a partisan angle at it, because it's not.
Yeah.
It just happens to be the party that I rest in.
Yeah. And GOP 2.0 for our listeners is Geoff's book, just released last week. Simon & Schuster are the publishers. And if you want to really understand what we're starting to dialogue on here, which is the things that you might hear or the things you might believe are frankly becoming less and less representative of the electorate. And I just think that's really important for people to understand. You have to be intentional if you really want to get to the bottom of where does this country stand on the issue of abortion? Where does this country stand on the issue of immigration? Where does this country stand on the issue of guns? It's probably not what we're hearing from either political party right now, or certainly the media representatives of those political parties. Yeah,
this is my perspective. I talk about this at several points in the book, but I feel like because of social media and other elements, the outside 5% on both sides are sound like or feel like they're driving the narratives.
Yeah.
And the reality is there's a silenced majority that just wakes up and doesn't really care about a Democrat or Republican being in charge. They want to make sure they got a job the next day. They want to make their kids make sure their kids are going to a good school and that their communities are safe and that their nation's secure. Those are the real issues. And so I think when we stop looking through the lens of being reelected and start looking through the lens of actually doing stuff, that's where this starts to make sense to people.
Yeah, that's really good. All right, so we're going to really prove that you are a good Samaritan and try to cross the divide. Dan, we're going to college athletics. That's where we always go with this podcast. I was in Athens this past weekend. You played baseball for Georgia Tech.
I did.
But your son is a student at Georgia.
He is. It creates a little bit of a divide, but we're very supportive.
All right, so maybe you're not as.
and my wife went to Georgia Tech too. So
yeah, right.
But he's a proud dog. He loves it up there. So on the campaign trail is one of the most divisive things running statewide. Right? It's seems to
the
be
Governor's Cup.
There's a lot more UGA alum or fans than Georgia Tech. And so I often had to remind folks the reason why I went to Georgia Tech was my senior in high school. Georgia Tech's head coach or one of their coaches showed up to my game. I threw a 9-inning no-hitter with 17 strikeouts.
That'll do it.
I ended up at Georgia Tech.
Yeah, there you go.
I mean, I was taking great care of my
Nicely
parents
done.
at that point. The scholarship ensued.
Yeah.
Outstanding. And you may have a second at Georgia, right? Maybe?
You never know.
Yeah.
I've got my middle one is a pretty good athlete, and certainly he's got that on his radar. Would love the chance to maybe get to play at Georgia.
Baseball?
Well, he's a football and baseball kid, but I remind him I'm his dad, and I'm not 6'4", 235, cut out of stone. So I think he'll probably end up being a baseball player in college, but he reminds me that football's still an option.
Awesome. Well, open invitation to the Duncan clan to come to Georgia on game day and experience it with our crowd. It's a ton of fun.
We actually were just in Charlotte and cheered them on to
there
their
you go.
victory
Good.
against Clemson. Yeah.
Nice.
So when you go to these games, David, are you top dog over there? Like you got like a suite? You got like
No. I'm legit. You were
the people.
I'm a man of the people. So
Face paint and all.
Section 305, row 18. Like we're in the heart of it. But we love going.
The tailgate's like the experience over there, right?
It's super fun. Yeah.
Cool.
Yeah. So, see, listeners, this is getting weirder by the minute. You hear Geoff's positions on policy on Georgia and Georgia Tech, like he's cut from a different cloth. I gotta imagine we probably should have started with this, Geoff, that some of your perspective has to do with your faith. So can you maybe tell our audience a little bit about your faith journey and how it does shape your political positions and perspective?
Yeah, it's a huge influencer, and rightfully so. I was one of those folks raised in an awesome family, took me to church, every Sunday, kind of introduced me to a life full of faith. But I left my house in high school and went off to college with my parents' faith and not my own. And so it took me some time. Greatest thing that happened to me was I met my wife in high school, and we went to college together and then got married. So life kind of came fast and furious with baseball and then kids and business and all that. But one of our really good friends from Georgia Tech brought us into the fold one day and invited us to North Point Church about 10 or 11 years ago. Next week, just as kind of Andy always describes, invited us into their small group. And next thing you knew, we're sitting there in somebody's living room on a Wednesday night, unpacking our faith even more. And it's just been a huge influencer to me. And, the part to me is politics is a really, really ugly place for religion a lot of times.
Yeah.
It's a difficult place because it's put on display as a beacon of, or badge of honor, as opposed to a operating mechanism. And so I've just been very, very aware of that.
Yeah, that's good. That's good. Well, I would argue that somebody like you should be on the political map, should be known versus unknown because of your positions on policy that you describe so well in the book. I mean, you kind of go through some tough categories in the book, GOP 2.0. You go through criminal justice issues. What is the pro-life position on prison policy? You go through immigration. You go through term limits. I mean, you have some really incredible positions that I feel like people on both sides of the aisle should embrace. It does seem like a lot of the good bipartisan work doesn't get a lot of press these days. And I don't necessarily want to go down the...
And it's interesting that you say it because I think we're now in such an environment where bipartisan work is not rewarded. So a lot of times when this stuff's happening behind the scenes, nobody really wants to be recognized by their tribe, whether it be D's or R's, as to working with the other side. It's almost villainized or looked down upon. And quite honestly, that couldn't be further from what the truth should be. We should be trying to find ways to work together. I mean, I could go on for hours with stories of folks that end up voting no on legislation that I supported, but gave me great feedback to improve it along the way. To me, that's really how our businesses operate. That's how our families operate, right? Trying to take nuggets of wisdom from people around you, just realizing that you never have, everything committed to memory, or, you don't ever get anything right out of the gates.
Yeah. But you wound up in the spotlight, for better or for worse, after the presidential election in 2020. Georgia was smack dab in the middle of the action because it took several days to kind of figure out where Georgia was going to land from an electoral vote standpoint. And then, of course, we had the recounts, and there were multiple recounts, as you describe in the book. Talk about what happened to you personally after Election Day, and then also highlight why you are convinced, as am I, because I read your book, the results in Georgia are the right results.
So, oftentimes, let's just go ahead and get this out of the way. Obviously, I spoke up loudly for a 10-week period of time and continue months afterwards that there was no systemic or widespread fraud that changed the outcome of the election. And that's just my position. I get there through facts and not any sort of any other.
And you lay out in the book like 6 or 7 reasons, right? Why you believe that way, and it's all based on data, like you mentioned.
So, almost every day people will find me, whether it be at the mall or at my kids' games or wherever, and it's just, say, hey, they really appreciate it. You're really courageous. And I don't see it as courageous because it took no courage to tell the truth, right? It just was one of those things where I wanted to just do the right thing. And so, our family personally, I'd go on for hours about all the, the nasty emails and the social media and the actual death threats that showed up and things of that nature. But our family stuck together, and there was never a doubt, me, my wife, my 3 kids, that we should be doing this, right? It's just never a doubt, right? There's a story in the book that really was this was a huge reminder to me right in the thick of it. My son was going into middle school, and at Brownsbridge, there was this, one night around a campfire, and the small group leader for my son handed us all the dads a coaster. It was like a scary moment, like a coaster and a Sharpie. It was like, write your son something inspirational. It's like a deer in headlights. Like, what am I going to write? Pressure. So yeah,
thanks for the heads up.
And I don't even know where this came from, but I wrote, like, doing the right thing will never be the wrong thing. Yeah. I truly believe that. I handed it to him, and it just, kind of sat next to his bed for a couple of years, and nobody knows, probably, it's where he puts his milkshakes at. Well, right in the thick of it, all this is firing off in all angles. And I said, Baylor, did you have that coaster? And he brings it down and he shows it to me. And it was just an unbelievable, firm reminder of we were doing the right thing. So that's really kind of been our center point. And it's actually been an opportunity for our family to grow closer together. And, my wife and I to really just double down on why did we get into politics? It wasn't to see our name in the paper. It was just to continue to try to find the right thing to do every day when you wake up.
Yeah. Well, you talk about this a little bit in the book. I may be showing some liberty here in my takeaway, but it seems to me if you're in politics or frankly in life, you're going to be grounded by something. And you kind of make it clear, hey, I'm not going to be grounded by how much money I raise, by do I win an election or lose an election. You're grounded by how are you going to stand in front of your wife and kids when things happen, and frankly, how are you going to stand in front of your Savior one day? And that, to me, is part of what is differentiating you, I think, in the political spectrum. But look, the heat came down, right? You have been in the crosshairs of some pretty nasty kind of treatment from the side that lost, and frankly, some people who are still in office in your party because of your position on this election being fair.
Yeah, I absolutely frustrate all of the political operatives that work around me, right? Because they want me to be out late with, donors or key influential folks late at night, or traveling all over the state and spending, days at a time away from home. And I just, with almost very few exceptions, I go home every single night.
Yeah.
It's a place to, it's a place to be grounded. My kids didn't sign up for dad to be lieutenant governor. I did. My marriage, certainly when I asked my wife, 20-something years ago, 23, going on 24, want to be specific there.
Yeah, get it right.
Because that matters. I didn't tell her, like, oh, by the way, when things start rolling with politics, I'm going to be gone for extended periods of time. And so I'm trying to redefine the job. And so far, so good, right? I mean, some would argue, I'm sure there's people listening here today that don't agree with me, and I respect that opinion immensely. But I'm trying to put on display that you can do this a different way. You can be more grounded to your values. And in my case, my values are very faith-centered. It just means a lot to get up every day and to try to put my best foot forward, my best Jesus foot forward.
Yeah.
And not as, some folks look at that, and I spend a lot of time in the book talking about this, but I try to put my best Jesus foot forward, even if you don't believe in him as being the Savior like I do. He was an incredibly good role model that history has just continued for thousands of years to be kind to. Regardless of what your faith story is, I point back to this person that just kind of made everybody important.
Yeah. Did you expect that it was going to be kind of as nasty as it was when you kind of defended the process in the state of Georgia? And, unfortunately, I don't think the media on either side is kind of helping people find the facts. What you laid out in the book, I don't know that I've seen anywhere written in the media. But were you surprised that and let me highlight this with something that you clarify in the book, which is this concept of doublethink, which is all kinds of Republicans who got elected to office in the state of Georgia through that same election were calling it unfair based on what happened at the presidential level. That seems a little weird, doesn't it? Where you get elected and you're calling the election unfair. Just talk about how weird that experience was for you.
Yeah, look, there's just riddled with hypocrisies all through this, and I spend some time in some of those pages just to try to artfully but factually kind of prove the story that, hey, this was legal and fair as far as the election goes. It's just one of those things where you just got to be intentional. I mean, yes, I did think it was going to be this bad, right? I think early on you could sense it because the angst had been built up for so long, and you could feel that this was the catalyst moment, right? That neither side was going to give in. The side that was sitting on the side of facts and the side that was sitting on the side of just being mad that they lost the election, right? And it was just going to be a battle point, an inflection point. And this was the catalyst. And so here we go. I was committed to it. He's pointing to a series that I don't know exactly when this plays, but Andy Stanley's in the midst of a series around integrity, and he said something the other day that was very, very just landed in my thinking. Was he said one of those things that you had to be was intentional up front. You had to just make the choice right out of the gates. Daniel had to just make the choice to live a life with God and not with the atmosphere that was around him, and he just made that decision as a 17-year-old. And for me, it was just one of those decisions. It was just, I wasn't going to go the other way. I wasn't going to be swayed unless the facts took us in a different direction, at which I was going to have to eat a huge humble pie. And certainly I would have been fine with that.
Yeah. Yeah. Wow. So Dan, I'm going to put you on the spot. So
come on.
Dan's a millennial. We give him an identity that maybe he doesn't want to sign up for, but Latino heritage from Colombia. Yep. What was your perspective? How did this feel? It kind of first Tuesday in November through how long did the two recounts take? I mean,
it went all the way through January 6th, essentially, and then is now continued in other. So because we had the runoff. Really, that's what kept us alive was the runoff on January 5th, and then the unfortunate events on the 6th.
Yeah, I just remember watching that on TV when they stormed the house. I was like, this is crazy. There was one of the most memorable things that's ever happened to me in this whole process, and I hope we'll never forget this. On January 6th, I was scheduled to be in the studio to speak to the BBC, which for whatever reason during the 10 weeks between the election and the runoff, me and the BBC kind of got along, and I was kind of on their evening news, right?
Gotcha.
Crazy as it is. I'm sitting there 20 minutes before I'm going live on the BBC for the evening news, and I'm watching a monitor underneath the camera of people invading the Capitol, and I was just in awe. I was just shocked.
As well.
And so they asked me, one of the opening questions was, you're the first American elected official to actually comment on this to Europe. What are your thoughts? And I'm like, I'm embarrassed.
Yeah.
I'm absolutely embarrassed. And don't judge us by this temporary moment of insanity. We are better than this. It's going to take us time to right the ship. But, I apologize to the world for this.
Yeah.
It was pretty just crazy just watching. I was like,
I forgot, that things were extended in Georgia because of the runoff. We had both Senate seats, up for grabs. So that I remember the Bush-Gore election, and that was only a few weeks, but it creates a sense of angst and uneasiness in the country, I think, when you don't know what has happened in your presidential election, and it just gets elongated. Like it creates tension in the country, regardless of what side of the aisle you're on.
And I thought about the same thing. I remember I was, I was a professional baseball player at the time, just married and whatnot for a few years. But I watched how that played out versus what played out this in 2020 and 2021. I mean, it was just a vast, I mean, regardless, you're going to be slanted on whoever won and whoever lost. You're obviously going to be slanted in one way or the other.
Sure.
Based on what your personal wish list was for that election cycle. But just to watch the courts and civility play out versus kind of mob rule and insanity was hard to watch. And I can't align that with my faith, right?
Yeah.
I think that was one of those elements for me. I just couldn't, I along with a lot of other things in politics, I can't align doing and saying something from 9 to 5 because as I've written in a few op-eds, well, that's just politics. Well, that's just politics has gotten us to where we're at today, where there's a divisive nature where people are willing to physically harm each other because of that's just politics. We don't say, well, that's just religion, right? I'm not going to love my neighbor because, well, you know, I get it, I'm supposed to, but my religion says I'm supposed to support this issue and you're not right on that issue. It's just wrong.
Yeah.
It's not inviting.
You know, I find myself, as Dan knows, maybe it's the sports fan in me, but I do think you tend to defend your own, you know, from time to time. We had Shane Winmeyer on this podcast, the executive director of Campus Pride. He reconciled with Dan Cathy after the boycott of Chick-fil-A. I tend to defend Chick-fil-A just because they're a Georgia employer, you know, and I like their sandwiches. But it was really good to have Shane on. He had led a boycott against Chick-fil-A, and he kind of talked about his reasons for that and how Dan Cathy reached out like a good Samaritan and how they ultimately built a friendship. And he winds up going to the Chick-fil-A Bowl, which I was a little, you know, jealous of to see LSU play Clemson.
And think about that. I mean, think about how powerful of a faith story that is.
Yeah,
I mean, we're called
absolutely.
to be humble, right? And what greater act of humility than to reach out to somebody that you're on polar opposite sides of an issue on.
Yes.
And look for opportunities to either extend grace or, as I talk about in the book, this really frustrates my political team, is intentional memory loss, right?
Yeah.
I mean, what better way to make an example to somebody than when they just blister you in the newspaper and the next morning you walk in and meet them at their desk talking about a totally different subject.
Yeah.
Right? I mean, that's an intentional opportunity to move past something, but it's not easy, right? It's not like it's human nature to go up to a bitter rival and try to work through it, but that's what we're called to do.
Yeah, it's good. But I do find myself defending Georgia for a couple data reasons that actually you highlight in the book. So one of the things, I think Georgia's taken a bit of a tough rap on kind of election, voting rights and that kind of thing. It was a Republican Congress, all Republicans, state Senate, state representatives that passed the no excuse absentee voting legislation in 2005.
That's
right?
correct.
Something like that. So for everybody out there who kind of wants to put Georgia in some kind of category, we've been fairly progressive in absentee voting for well before this presidential election. And then you mentioned in 2016, I'm going to get the data wrong, but last presidential election, there were how many million absentee votes? It was like 16 million or 25 million. Like some absentee voting has been a standard in Georgia for quite some time. So to call it to question in 2020 didn't necessarily make sense based on the data.
Right. I spent some time in the book talking about the election reform bills that came in, and there was all kinds of gyrations. It's a very complicated, you know, kind of 3D chess. There was some really bad ideas that flew in early. And one of those I thought was the elimination of no excuse absentee voting, which, as you mentioned, was a 2005 Republican initiative. And then all of a sudden now we look up, 15 years later and we wanted to flip-flop it because it just didn't feel like it worked out for us in that scenario. Terrible message to send to people that you really truly have the long-term best interest of the state in mind,
exactly.
in my opinion. I dug in on it. And ultimately that was removed from that legislation and the process worked. There were some other really rough ideas, right? Like how do you message eliminating food and water in line? I mean, maybe there's some good scenario that you could paint a picture that really it could influence a significant amount of votes. I had yet to ever seen any sort of scenario play out. I just didn't think it was a good step in the right direction. One of the ways I leave this in a lot of interviews is, look, election reform in 2020 for Republicans or 2021 for Republicans was a lot like, the Braves or the Falcons having a losing season and then raising their ticket prices the next year, right? They have every right to do it. But it's just not really very good timing, right? It just feels oddly placed.
Yeah, it's good. Well, we've talked a little bit about your faith. I would say your athletic background has shaped, your views on politics. your private sector experience, your family, you have some kind of unique approaches to political policy. And you've got some nice acronyms here that I'd like for you to maybe.
I'm an acronym guy. I didn't realize it until I got into politics.
Stuff,
right,
though,
I know.
Right,
that.
like it's a great way to remember.
It's like the
things.
KISS method. Keep it simple.
First time you and I met, you talked about the 4 C's, and you are passionate about. There's other ways to deliver solutions than just growing the size of government, right, and taxing people more. The 4 C's has shaped some of your policy. Talk about that one for a minute.
Yeah, so the 4 C's, which is churches, charities, corporations, and citizens, really kind of flew into my mindset a long time ago, probably 10 years ago when we participated in our first Be Rich program at North Point Church. It was just one of those things where I watched the power of the 4 C's, right? The church, the charities, the corporations, and just the people who showed up and worked on, whether it be, food pantry, which I talk about as a volunteer project for our small group, or homelessness or hunger or addiction, all of those things show up with more than a government program ever will, right? So if you're one of the 4 C's and you care about a problem, you're going to show up with volunteerism, which is an exponential, extension of your ability to help. You're going to show up with innovation. You're going to use the latest and greatest to be efficient. And you've got exit strategy on the tip of your tongue. Like every move you make, if you're one of the 4 C's to help somebody, a child, foster care, you name it, you're there for exit strategy. Where even on its best day, a government program shows up and wants to just stabilize. Doesn't make them bad. That's just what they're wired to do. And so looking for ways, and for me, I think it's a bipartisan pathway, but as a conservative, I think it's a great way to actually show up to the scene of a problem and start to action into doing stuff that helps.
Yeah.
And I think there's an endless sea of opportunities for us to use the 4 C's in a wider stretch than we currently do.
That's good. The power of 2, 3, and more.
Yeah, so the power of 2, the power of 3, the power of more. And this was a really, really unique opportunity for me to kind of put forward where I really think there's some big adjustments to be made. And this is just a direct shot right at folks in politics to start with, but also just a broader audience. Gentleman next to me, Dewey McClain, flew in from outer space, as hardcore of a Democrat as you could have. God decided that the best place for him to sit out of 180 seats in that chamber was sitting right next to me in the state house. And I got to know Dewey, but I got to understand the value of knowing somebody on the other side of an issue.
Yeah.
And hopefully he did too. And his smile when he realized he was in my book, when he started getting tweets, tagging him all over the place, he's like, brother, I love you more.
Which I did as well.
Yeah, I love you more now than I do. And what's right is right and what's wrong is wrong. And that's really, and to think about it, that's probably where that influential, handwritten message on my son's coaster flew in from outer space, was just that notion that Dewey was there.
So the power of 2 is go find somebody who is on the opposite side of the aisle, maybe on the opposite side of your faith, maybe on the opposite side of your worldview, whatever. Strike up a relationship and learn something.
Absolutely.
Yeah.
It's going to make you a better decision maker. It's going to make you a better thinker. And it's just probably going to make you a better human, right?
Yeah. So power of 3, Dan, before he talks about the power of 3, what's your news source? Do you have a go-to news source?
Walking through Samaria.
Well played. I see what you did there.
Because this is cool. Tell us about the power of 3.
So the power of 3 is, just trying to get your news sources from different places.
Yeah,
that's
right.
Good, yeah.
And look, we're all guilty of turning on something that we agree with 112% of the time. I get it.
Yeah.
But if we're truly going to be making comments on social media, if we're going to be engaged in conversations at the office, if we're going to be just putting our opinion out there, we ought to probably gather more of the facts than from just echo chambers.
Yeah.
And so I put the notion out there of looking at, and we use some polling data and some information. It's pretty fascinating, right? Folks on the left really get their information from one source. Folks on the right get their information from the other source. But if you flip the reciprocal and you look at what the other side thinks of the other side, then it's the
most distrusted.
Yeah, it's just eye-opening.
Yeah.
So here's what you do. Go get your your news from CNN if that's what makes you happy, or from Fox that's your early source. But then go stumble into a PBS broadcast, later in the evening to get a more
Associated
balanced.
Press,
Yeah,
USA Today.
Go pick up the USA Today. Go read. Follow somebody on Twitter from the Associated Press. Like, just gather all sides. I find myself. It's fascinating to see how much more well-rounded my opinion gets.
Yeah. Because
of gathering information from other places.
Yeah, it's good. It I'm trying to remember where your data came from, but you have this really clear chart, and I just want to call out the names because you have to almost laugh at yourself when you look at it. So if you're on the left, you trust CNN, MSNBC, oh gosh, who would be Huffington Post, right? If you're on the right, you trust Fox News, Breitbart, whatever. And then the most distrusted are those same ones if you're on the opposite side, right? It's crazy. And then if you poll all American adults and you get into independence, you realize the most trusted sources really are Associated Press, PBS, Wall Street Journal, USA Today. I'm trying to remember the fifth one. Anyway, and you have to chuckle at yourself. You have to go, okay, if I really do want to be grounded, if I really do want to be well-rounded, I better go outside.
Yeah, and look, this is our job as consumers, right?
Yes, that's right.
And we've got to be self-disciplined enough. And look, it's troubling to watch. All throughout my political career, I could walk into a room full of all Republicans or all Democrats and just kind of hear the differences of opinions. But the real people who kind of lock themselves in the room and come up with solutions around healthcare. I think about we've passed over 50 healthcare bills in the state Senate, bipartisan for the most part, almost every one of them, right? I think if I was only looking through my talking points through what you would see in conservative media, I would only sit there and complain about, X or Y or Z. Vice versa. If folks on the left were all only concerned with their media sources, they would only hear about the right, blah, blah, blah. We can work together. And we've got to do more than just using social media as our information source. We just have to.
Yes.
Right?
Yes,
I mean,
that's right.
I'll give you a quick anecdotal piece of how that works. So during the whole 10 weeks, life was just falling apart in every which way. People were holding me accountable. Like you're lying. You'd be in the grocery store. I mean, like you took money from the Chinese. Like it was crazy, right? And my poor wife, right? They knew that I was pretty hardened, but they'd go to her and they'd start pinging her.
Oh my gosh.
And so she's like, "What do I do? Like my really good friend is saying that this is all stolen and rigged, and I'm missing all. I said, ask them for their source of information and say that you'll pass it on to your husband, right? Because I'll go follow up the lead." And she said almost like 10 for 10. It was, well, I don't really have any information. I saw it on Facebook, right? And it's like, okay, so you want to reinvent the world.
Yeah.
You want to hold people accountable, arrest people, because of a Facebook post, right? We just got to be better than that.
Yeah, that's good. So the power of more, I think was that the volunteerism piece? So let me tee this one up if you don't mind. Because you'll remember this. Danielle Strickland, who's a Canadian. I don't know why I said that, but she's from Canada. But anyway, she was on our podcast a little while back. She's phenomenal. I mean, she grew up doing social justice before it was even a thing, right? Serving in homeless LGBTQ youth at a soup kitchen in downtown Toronto, like years ago, her and her husband, doing these kinds of things. And she's like, you Americans, she's like, just get out of your heads and go serve somebody. I think in the book, you write that one of your close friends said, let's just go love on them. But when you talk about the power of more, you tee up volunteerism or kind of getting out and serving in light of today's reality of our kind of social situation, which is people are becoming more and more isolated. People are becoming more and more tribal. So talk about how important it is to break through that with service, because otherwise it's just going to get worse.
Yeah. So volunteerism for me goes back to the notion of it's better to give than receive. And everybody listening who's ever felt that feeling knows exactly what that feeling feels like. It is like all of a sudden life comes together in a moment and you realize that it did feel better to give than receive. And that's what the volunteerism piece is. I think there's an opportunity in this country for us to kind of have, our cake and eat it too, and with volunteerism, right? We can go solve a lot of people's problems in this country, right? Whether it be foster kids, whether it be homelessness, hunger, all of those things that kind of fit within the gaps in society, whether it be surrounded by poverty or surrounded by addiction. But we can have a wave of volunteerism like we've never seen before. Because here's where you have your cake and eat it too. One, we solve the problem, and two, we shrink the size of government.
Yeah.
Right?
Yeah.
To think that we should lean into government, right? Like I was as guilty as anybody before getting into politics of writing what I felt like was a big check, putting it in my mailbox, paying my taxes and saying, look, I've paid for those problems to be solved.
Not my problem.
Right.
Not my problem. Somebody else's.
I took care of I paid my taxes. But the reality of that is insensitive and ineffective. The reality is,
and probably not consistent with the gospel.
It's
right?
not. It totally doesn't align. Like even if I do pay my taxes in full and government never shrinks, I should still be called to go love on my neighbor. even if they didn't vote for me, even if they don't see eye to eye, even if they believe in a totally different ideology around what X and Y and Z.
Yeah.
But this whole notion of volunteerism, it's good for the people that we're helping, but it's so good for our spirit and the spirit of America. And to me, look, some may listen to this and say, naive 101. Geoff Duncan is the most naive human being I've ever listened to. So be it. If I've been accused of something, I'll be that's fine. But I can see a day where we have a wave of volunteerism that literally walks across this country in every single community, every single household, and grabs our attention, and we all of a sudden exponentially solve people's problems.
Yeah, that's good.
And by the way, we spread the gospel while we're at it.
Yeah, exactly. And you may remember, I think it was podcast number 2 with Doreen Diaz, this very podcast. That's what they did to go attack the gang crisis in Southern California. Like the church went out and created these days, and they were doing haircuts, and they were doing diaper giveaways to the young single moms and all kinds of things to go right after the issue of gang violence in Southern California, which cost her brother's life, and that was their solution.
Yep, and it leads to a generational effect. And like I said, from a fiscal perspective, it does shrink the size of government. It allows us to change the trajectory of where we're at. And I think that's a bipartisan, opportunity for us to meet in the middle.
Yeah. So this is the most incredible thing I read in the book. And it's probably just because we've had Batya Ungar-Sargon on this podcast. Dan, you may remember. She's the deputy opinion editor at Newsweek, dear friend of ours. She wrote a book on the unity of a African-American and a largely white church in Charlotte. Incredible story right before the Charlotte race riots in 2016. But she talked a lot about how the electorate, the citizens of this country are being less and less represented by these two polarized political parties and the media that's writing about them. And she's a journalist. But anyway, I tend to feel sometimes that the consumer, the electorate, citizenry or whatever is getting lost in a lot of this. And I'll digress for a second and go back to college athletics for a second. When we had the big debate this time last year, plus maybe a month or two, about what was going to happen with college football, right? So what was it going to mean to the athletes? What was it going to mean to the colleges? What was it going to mean to the sports media organizations? And I was kind of raising my hand.
You're talking about the licensing.
I was at that time. It was, are we going to have college football?
Okay,
or
I
not?
got you.
And so, sorry, I didn't actually state what the issue was. And I was kind of raising my hand, going, "Hey, like, I'm a fan. I'm a season ticket holder. Like, does anybody care what I have to say? Like, I don't want to put anybody's life at risk. Don't get me wrong, but I'm a consumer. I'm paying money, for this, and nobody's asking what the consumer wants. So anyway, sorry for that long introduction, but here's what you write. And I just think, your position on policy was probably the most insightful thing that I read, but this just struck me. So page 242 in the book, for anybody out there that gets your hands on GOP 2.0 from Geoff Duncan, the top of page 242, here's what he writes. Late one night during a long session before the vote, a young page delivered a small note to me at my desk in the House chamber. Is this as lieutenant governor or is this state representative? So you're a state representative.
Freshly sworn in, maybe a year or two into it.
It said a constituent, that's who you serve, right? A constituent, not a donor, not a media representative. You serve constituents. Wanted to speak with me about the medical cannabis bill. I love this. The note didn't say whether the constituent was for or against the bill. Here's what you write, which just blew me away. I left the chamber to, quote, hear from one of my bosses.
Yep.
That's, in fact, what our elected representatives are supposed to do, correct? They are supposed to serve their constituents, and you actually call them your bosses. How rare, I'm like pounding my fist on the desk. How rare is this in politics today?
Well, that conversation with her literally changed the trajectory of my life. It changed, hopefully, the trajectory of their family's life and the state. But look, we got to have this servant's mentality of, we were sent down here to go to work, but also you got to have real conversations with people. I had to legitimately tell her up front, I was not in favor of voting yes for medical cannabis because quite honestly, what I quickly came to find out in 45 minutes sitting there with her, I didn't know anything about the issue. I only knew 3 or 4 talking points that had been fed to me in a very conservative district that I represented. But I ultimately got more information from her, was able to go find the things that I had further questions on, get those answered, and voted yes on it.
Yeah.
And it literally, I mean, Christy Baggerly was an amazing woman who literally took her family, her daughters down to the Capitol, and her little daughter, Kendall, who was sitting there, seizing up as I was sitting there talking to her and walking me through it. It was just one of the more phenomenal moments of my life.
Wow.
Yeah.
That's amazing.
It's a hot issue. People are scared of it.
Yeah. My takeaway was, my simple walk away was, if we can get a man to the moon in 3 days, we can figure out how to deliver medical cannabis oil to small kids and those in medical needs of it, and keep it out of the hands of those that shouldn't be using it, as far as the legalities of it. Outside of all the other issues, there's going to be opportunities to have conversations and debate, but over helping people who actually can be healthier because of it, I just wasn't willing to look the other way.
You can deliver Xanax and Oxycontin like that.
Yeah.
So.
Yeah.
Yep.
So I'm going to go off script for a second here, Geoff, because I want to lean into another issue that your position changed as well. You write about this in the book, and I think this is, look, I get that it's divisive. Most of the issues, frankly, that our society is trying to solve right now are hard, right? They're complex, and that's why they probably remain unsolved. But I think as believers, we do have to think a little bit more about this one. Our very first podcast, Dan was with Lee Jenkins, African-American pastor, senior pastor of Eagles Nest Church in Roswell, ran for mayor of Roswell, lost in a runoff, but really thoughtful about policy issues like you are from a faith perspective. And I think we learned a lot about the criminal justice system in Georgia from some of his stories. And then, of course, unfortunately, we walk through the Ahmaud Arbery issue, which you talk a lot about. You spoke with his mom as you started to lean into hate crimes legislation here in Georgia. I think the more I read the book, America's Original Sin from Dr. Jim Wallace at the recommendation of Lee Jenkins. And I think the more you lean into criminal justice issues in this country, it does become complex. And as believers, I think law and order is something that you even talk about that in the book. Like, it's something we probably believe in, that you don't probably have counties and cities and countries and municipalities if you don't have security. But the criminal justice system is probably something that has had our Latino brothers and sisters and our African-American brothers and sisters probably not 100% fair, we could say, over the course of history. Over time, your position on the death penalty has changed. And not trying to convince any of our listeners what side of that issue they should fall on. I just think from a faith journey perspective and from a investigating policy perspective, you've moved on this. And can you describe what that's like as an elected representative to actually change your position on something that's so important?
I think the most interesting part of my position change on this is the process that got me there, right? Because I'm just little bitty Geoff Duncan, lieutenant governor, and so what does really my opinion matter on the death penalty? But I got there based on, my whole life, I guess I was pro-death penalty. I never really ever had any sort of personal circumstance that I ever contemplated it. And then once getting into elected office, it really wasn't an issue that crossed my plate. But one of my sons brought it to my attention as I was working we had a Georgia Heartbeat bill that was in the legislature, and I was supportive of it. And one of my sons came to me and just simply sat down and was like, "Hey, tell me how you're so supportive of, life at birth, or unborn, but yet you support the death penalty, Dad. How do you reconcile that?" And it was just like a gut punch. It was an eye opener, and I began to unpack that in my mind. And I'm all about justice, right? I certainly don't want to try to speak to a family that has lost a loved one due to some awful, heinous crime. That's not where I'm going with this. But from my personal standpoint, I just feel like to be authentic on both sides of that life issue, that I've moved away from my position as being pro-death penalty. I feel like there's an opportunity to have pro-life sentencing, which is what I refer to it in the book.
Yeah.
And one that holds people accountable for doing something heinous and follow through the letter of the law. But I've gotten comfortable with letting God be the ultimate decider on life, and not me or a government type system.
And we can even speak to some conservative values on this issue, and I think you do that in the book. And I just think it's another highlight of how thoughtful you are on these issues. One issue is we know we have sentenced innocent lives to death. That's one issue.
That's a fact.
That's a fact. And then the second reality is kind of the cost, right? The expense. And so if you want to talk to fiscal conservatives out there, there's a monetary issue that's associated
right. And what
with
most
this
folks,
as well.
Yeah, I mean, there's going to be some folks listening that think in dollars and cents.
Yeah.
And the dollars and cents of somebody being sentenced to death is off the charts because there's appeal after appeal after appeal, which there should be, by the way.
Yep.
That the state, provides the funding for all of that legal team to be there. So look, I don't look at it through that lens. I look at it through the humanity of it, and just feel like there's an opportunity. I do highlight, as I think the number is 53, other countries that I was able to research and find that are also only 53 countries in the rest of the world still support the death penalty, and you would just not feel good about
being on that list.
Being on that list when you look at it, right?
Yeah, so, exactly.
It's one of those positions that I think history will eventually move its feet. I think my party will eventually move its feet. An overwhelming majority of Americans will move their feet on the issue. I just personally decided to put that out there as I've moved my feet.
Yeah, that's awesome. Well, before we wind down, there's another commonality from this discussion with a previous podcast that we have done. We had Janine Maxwell on from Project Kane, Heart for Africa. The name of her book is Hope Lives Here. That's coming out, like in the next week or so. And she educated us on Rotarians. I got to make sure I get the pronunciation correct. That's it, right?
Yeah,
Rotarians, the Rotary Club.
Rotary Clubs.
So
if you've ever run for statewide office, you know exactly what a Rotary Club is.
So talk about their kind of 4-part. They have some rules about how they kind of think about policies and organizations or things they should support. Because I think Rotarians ultimately kind of move money around. Is that sort of what they do? Anyway, tell us about Rotarians and why you like their mantra, if you will, about how they look at things. So
I'm not a Rotarian, so just full disclosure. But I feel like I'm a card-carrying member. I've spoken at so many around the state. And even during the campaign for 2.5 years, my wife will say I begged for the job. I say I campaigned for the job. But I was always find myself in Rotary Clubs at lunch somewhere in the state. And I loved going in there because everybody has the expectation that you're going to be nonpartisan. And I loved being able to talk about, the approach and the purpose and kind of how we can heal this thing, even before the explosion of 2020 post-election debacle. So the interesting thing was, as I started to figure out why I liked Rotary Clubs so much, and the average Rotarian was, there was more to it. And their 4-way test that they give, and I don't have them off the top of my head right now. I can flick through the book and find them. But the 4-way test was not built from a group that came together. It's like, well, what are the 4 things that we can do and say that's going to attract everybody in our community and just think we're like the highest ground? There was a guy that was like way back in the early 1900s that was trying to save a business, and he realized that he had a culture problem, right? And his culture problem was if he was going to save the business, it wasn't because he was going to go out and get a loan. It wasn't because he was going to go out and, refinance or restructure. It was he went to the core of the problem, and he was about honesty and integrity and just really approaching this from the right way. And so the Rotarians, as they kind of open up every day, they do the 4-way test, and everybody gets up and says it. And it, maybe 50 times just never dawned on me. And then all of a sudden it was like, wait a minute, there's something here. Yeah. Right? There's a higher calling than just attracting people to a lunch so that you can take a picture for the newspaper and show that you were full. It's actually driving to the core. And some of the greatest questions I get are from Rotarians when I walk off the sage after talking. I just spoke at the Atlanta Rotary, and it's just generated so many conversations around, why you do things. Because ultimately, I think from a business standpoint, culture matters, right? I'm sure here you guys build a culture that matters.
Culture
right?
matters,
right.
absolutely.
You're paying attention to, and sometimes you're maybe tone deaf or have blind spots, and so that's why you have 360 reviews and all that stuff that helps you get there. But we have a culture problem in politics, right? That's really what the problem is. The culture problem is that we're okay with a 10-second soundbite to shape our politics for the day. or we're okay getting a one-sided argument like the power of three, right? A one-sided argument to kind of shape where we're going with something. We got to fix the culture problem.
Yeah.
And so I think we got to really start putting a four-way test out there.
That's good. Love it. Cool. Well, at some point, you go through this experience starting in early November through early January, and it probably hasn't stopped. But somewhere along the lines of your career, you decide two things: not to run for re-election for lieutenant governor of the state of Georgia, huge loss for our state, I must say, and to write this book. So talk about your motivations for both of those decisions, and what do you hope people experience when they get their hands on GOP 2.0?
So I've got 15 months left on this term. So still got a lot of hard work to do. We are definitely going to attack healthcare. We're going to continue to make great progress on foster care and some other things out there that are really, really important to us. Crime. So we're going to run through first base as fast as we can. The pivot point for me was not about getting out. I love the job. It wasn't getting out of politics. It's stepping up into an even bigger role. And the role is helping to heal and reshape my party, but in reality, help heal and rebuild the rules of engagement between both parties. If GOP 2.0, the movement, not the book, the movement is successful, I think it helps both parties. It helps redefine those rules of engagement. Yeah. It helps put the policies closer to the middle and allows us to try to figure out, where we can go with stuff. What are real solutions that are out there for us to be able to move towards? And that's my commitment. And this is really a bandwidth issue. If I'm going to have a conversation with Georgia, then I could do that as the lieutenant governor or campaigning to continue to be the lieutenant governor. Yeah. But I feel called to have a conversation with America. And there's 350 million people that need to hear this. Yes. And so there's a bandwidth issue. I'm either going to try to win an election or I'm going to try to have a conversation with America. And I've decided to do that through the book. The book is the starting point. It's the catalyst that allows me to kind of it's certainly opened up this opportunity to be with you guys here today. It's opened up a ton of opportunities and will continue to. But this is not about the book. This is about the movement. And the movement is got no sort of aspirations other than trying to heal and rebuild and take us to a different place than we are today. Because I don't want to say to my grandkids, hey, I kind of had a seat at the table and I chose to just stay where I was at. Yeah. I want to move this thing in a better direction. Yeah. Dan, I remembered there's another kind of political invitation that we've made for this podcast. He's been ducking us for a long time. But this is another example of where we are as a country and where we need to get to, which is kind of what you just talked about, Geoff. We extended an invitation to Van Jones to come be a guest on this podcast. And here was the reason. I thought this was a hoot. So when President Trump signed the First Step Act, and to be very fair, I think every Democrat supported it and not every Republican supported it. And I think it was Kushner that actually lobbied Trump to say, hey, you really need to do this. Well, the First Step Act has been I would largely say, a positive move forward for criminal justice reform in this country. And more Democrats supported it than Republicans, but credit to the administration at the time for signing it. Well, Van Jones accepted an invitation to speak at CPAC. And he kind of did hey, you guys, you've embraced my issue. Like, hats off to conservatives for actually doing something in the area of criminal justice reform. And of course, as you would probably expect, he just got annihilated from the left because they're like, how could you go to the CPAC, and speak? But it's an example, in my opinion, of being a good Samaritan. You walk across the road, you go engage with somebody who's not like you, who's seen as the other, who's seen as maybe even the enemy, and you create a conversation. I mean, this is sort of what a lot of your policy positions are about. But what I want our listeners to understand, hopefully you will get your hands on the book, because I think it's really insightful with respect to what happened with the 2020 election, particularly in the state of Georgia, how dysfunctional our overall political system has become.
But you are an unapologetic conservative just because you don't believe big government is the systemic answer to the problems that ill this nation at this time. You believe there's other ways to solve them, but you are probably one of the most compassionate, insightful politicians I've ever read about in terms of policy positions. But that people would call you not a conservative because of that, which is kind of the wrong way to go about it.
Right. We've lost our way. I'll speak to the Republican Party just because I'm a card-carrying member of it, and somehow figured out that being mad or angry is a conservative principle, and it's not. We've got to lose this bitterness towards folks that disagree with us, and be willing to have conversations. Because I think ultimately, one, it's a bridge building technique, right? It's one that helps us continue to keep a coalition alive. But two, it's just the right thing to do, and it helps us be better at solutions. And it's something I've learned in the business world, right? If we argued around a boardroom table like we do around a political table, the place would go out of business.
Yeah, nothing would ever
They
get
shut
done.
the door.
That's right.
Nobody would want to work there. It'd be toxic. Nobody would want to invest, right? Like I go on and on and on. But somehow we've all figured out that it's okay. And I go on for years for telling you why. I mean, the whole political consultant class has just sucked the life out of folks and just kind of built the system towards who can throw the sharpest, strongest, most explosive arrow to the other side at the latest possible moment, and you win.
Yeah.
Well, that doesn't fix the problems we got in America.
I think I put this out on Facebook maybe a few years ago because it's, it just, our political landscape is fairly ugly. But I said something like, I would never run a business, kind of like what you said, but just to give it a little more color, waking up in the morning and going, you know what? Half my employees, forget them. I don't want to hear from them. I don't want to serve them. I don't want to know what their ideas are. Like, I can't imagine running anything, a church, a school, a university, a small business, a big business, whatever it might be, and getting up in the morning and go, you know what? Half of them, I don't care.
Yeah, and
it makes no sense to me.
Yeah, and think about this. I mean, if you're a party, a political party, and you compare yourself to a business, and as a business owner, if you think about a 20-year period of time, just think about how much you've moved your feet, how much you've innovated, how much you've progressed in your thinking, and all three-dimensional. We as a party have got to start doing that, not because we want to be less conservative or less liberal or more conservative, whatever the story is. You just got to be willing to understand who our customer is, and be willing to be the party of ideas, right? And that's both sides of the aisle.
Well said. So Dan, but before we, ask Geoff to talk about the book a little bit more, let's put him on the hot seat. I want you to ask what's the question you've always, as a millennial?
I don't like that look on your face.
As a
you look
millennial,
like you got a good one.
as a Latino American, like what's the question you've always wanted to ask a politician here in the United States about something crazy?
Something crazy. I mean, going to the marijuana thing, I see, it's starting to become legal in a lot of states. And, one day it will be legal in Georgia, I'm sure. One day. And my concern is with people who've been arrested for nonviolent offenders with marijuana crimes and what they're coming home to. Because now we're seeing businesses getting tied into this and a lot of money being made corporately through this. And I think those guys who did time need first dibs on that because they actually paid the way to a new system. Like, it's going to be like cigarettes. It's going to be like alcohol companies. There's going to be endorsements. These guys need reparations for that, I think.
Yeah, it's a complicated issue.
That's a good one.
I never gave much thought about the whole marijuana / medical marijuana, going, kind of growing up in early adulthood. Once I got into politics, I realized it was a complex issue. We just talked about the medical cannabis situation, but now there's all types of, we've now enacted the growing operations for medical purposes. There seems to be a lot of industry tug and pull. I know that the governor and I are both very firmly committed, as long as we're in office, not to take any steps towards recreational use. It feels like there's a federal tug in a different direction. There'll be a lot of time to tell. Criminal justice reform is complicated on all you mentioned that particular issue, but there's others out there. It's complicated. It certainly is, and one that we've got to walk into understanding the science behind it, understanding, for me, I guess the closest equation was, in the book I talk about the potential use of steroids. And I was kind of faced with a similar dilemma when I was playing, right? I was stuck in AAA. I wanted to go to the big leagues. Not because I wanted to see myself on TV, but because I wanted to make a couple $1 million so I could support my wife and kids and have the life that we always wanted to have. And if I could just get there for, a year, I could do it. A lot of my friends were using steroids, and Brooke and I just decided at the end of the day, we just wouldn't do it.
Yeah.
It just wasn't worth getting there, knowing that we broke the rules.
Yeah.
And then watching
that it could kill you.
Yeah, and by the way, we had some other personal health stories that we didn't really want to, put into play. Oh. But yes, I mean it's a very tough issue, and there's friends of mine that their careers were negatively affected because they ultimately then got drug tested. But it's a complicated issue, and you rose to the occasion and asked a tough question, but certainly don't have the answer. But we got to go through this with getting all sides of the equation brought to the table.
That's good. All right. How do people get their hands on the book?
So it's all over the country, right? So bookstores, your local bookstores, Barnes & Noble, your independent bookstores.
We still have those? Are we still have those?
I know.
Those are still there?
Yes, they are. And we're grateful for that. Yeah. They're great. Amazon, Barnes & Noble, Books A Million, all of your outlets. You can go to our website at gop2.org, gop2.org, and you can order there. You can also see some content, some media stuff. It's been an amazing journey, right? We were on, a lot of the TV morning shows, afternoon shows, Sunday shows, kind of put some of that stuff out there.
What about you? What if people want to follow you, get content from you? How might they go about doing that? Twitter
is probably the best way to do it. If you're looking for a fist fight, don't follow me because I'm pretty boring as far as I don't pick fights. Even when the former president decided to pick on me, I think I only ever replied once, and it was with my kids sitting around me, kind of a group reply.
Yeah.
I thanked him for conservative leadership and asked him to help me, in winning the runoff elections, but that didn't go very well. Anyways, so Twitter is probably and it's at Geoff Duncan GA, and I'm one of those goofy Jeffs that spells his name with a G. So it's at GEOFF Duncan GA. Is the best place to follow me on Twitter. And he's
certified. He's got the blue check, so
that's pretty cool,
it's
right?
him.
My kids still think I'm cool. I've got the blue check.
I have 137 followers, Dan. I can't apply for the blue check yet, so nobody's trying to impersonate me on Twitter, that's for sure. Are there, just while we've got you, Geoff, I know only a couple more minutes, but I am probably being in business for, since 1989, so 32 years, geez Louise. I probably tend to believe that non-government solutions are more sustainable, more productive, more efficient. So I probably do lean on the fiscal conservative side, but the social issues do have me frustrated, as a Republican, that we're just not doing more in the area of compassionate immigration reform, of compassionate justice reform, of equality just across a number of landscapes. Any other books out there that are really good on the policy side where it doesn't matter if you're a Democrat or a Republican, like you would be more educated if you got your hands on those things?
I don't know of any off the top of my head that are of recent. I listened to George W. Bush over the weekend on his 9/11 speech. And there's some pushback to it based upon some angles that he had in that speech. But I'm just a sucker for good leadership.
Yeah, that's good.
I'm just, and so for me, genuine leadership just can't be replaced. Yeah. And so I think as we dive into issue by issue by issue, it goes back to, Brooke and I, my wife and I talk about this often. We were raising 3 boys. And you get caught in this trap of trying to teach them issue by issue. But really what we need to teach them is how to be great decision makers, because life's going to throw them all kinds of questions. Yeah. And I think that's ultimately what we're going to gravitate towards. I think the goal of GOP 2.0 is to promote finding adults in the room that are going to lead us, lead our states, lead our counties, lead our cities, lead our country, lead our businesses, right? Because that's really where we gravitate towards the places that, our place of work. We pick CEOs that are ultimately able to, be the adult in the room, to make the big decisions that make sense most of the time, that ultimately jive with the majority of the people that are a part of the organization.
Yeah.
So for me, I'm just a sucker for good leadership. And I think there's a vacuum of epic proportion in all of politics on all sides. Yeah. That, and that's ultimately where I think this rises to the occasion.
Yeah. You've been, I got one more. They just keep coming because we don't want to let you go. This is such a fun conversation. But the Twitter thing. So You and I talked about this the first time we met, and listeners, I think I've mentioned this a time or two as well. We're definitely in the political throes of things in this conversation, but I grew up in Louisville, Kentucky. I was born in Chicago, grew up in Louisville, Kentucky, went back to Chicago for business school and for the start of my career. And one of the races that really intrigued me was the Matt Bevin, Andy Beshear re-election. Governor Bevin was running for re-election in Kentucky, and he lost. And he lost a very close race in Kentucky 1 or 2 years before the presidential election. I think maybe one. And I told my wife, I said, I just don't think this bodes well for President Trump, particularly when Mitch McConnell got overwhelmingly reelected as a senator in Kentucky over a very good candidate, female military veteran Amy McGrath in Kentucky. I mean, McConnell won hands down the Senate race. And I said, this just doesn't bode well for President Trump, because Matt Bevin was a bit abrasive. He's a believer. He's a very smart private equity, guy, but a bit abrasive in terms of his style. And I'm like, man, if Kentucky doesn't reelect Matt Bevin, I have a hard time seeing how the country reelects Donald Trump, because he's pretty mean, right, in terms of just his style, right? He's abrasive. He's a bully, I think is probably the term that would be okay.
I use that word a few times in the book.
Okay, yeah. So here's why I'm going back to Twitter. One of the things that, that I did appreciate was when, at that time, presidential candidate Biden tweeted to then President Trump, Jill and I are so sorry that you lost your brother. And I think, we know how that feels, losing a family member was something. And you could just feel like the whole country kind of go, like a civil tweet from one of our senior leaders. And then the reason this came to my mind was because you mentioned President George W. Bush's speech. Well, former President Clinton actually tweeted out just recently, so thankful for your leadership, George W. Bush. And again, it's just good for the country to have our leaders just throw something civil out there. And I actually think President Clinton and President Bush are fairly good friends and have tackled some things together, post their time in office. Can you just talk about why that's so important? I mean, in your book, you talk about integrity. Why is it important that we behave well in terms of how we treat one another?
Yeah, so in the book I talk about this, but aloe on sunburn. Really, like, we want to just make this feel like aloe on sunburn, because think about how much we've changed. And I don't know what the exact metrics is, maybe 10 years, right? It's where if a politician made an angry response, that was the news of the day. Vice versa, if a politician makes a very warm and bipartisan statement, that's the news of the day, right? Like, so how much have we shifted? I think there's a vacuum and void, and that's why this type of vernacular, GOP 2.0, just feels like it's gaining the momentum, because there's just a void there. Yeah, there's such an emptiness of waiting for folks to try to work together. It doesn't mean you need to soften your positions. You can still believe in all the things that you believe in, but just do it with a better tone. I talk about it in the book, Policy, Empathy, and Tone, my pet project. Yeah. Policy,
we missed that acronym.
Policy, empathy, and tone. There's my another acronym. Policies, we've had a good discussion there. Empathy is really understanding truly somebody's problems, right? I think there's a void for that in America. We keep telling people what their problems are, but I don't really know that single mom with 2 jobs and 3 kids. I don't really know what her problems are unless I ask her. Yeah. I can tell her. Right. And then the T is tone, right? Let's go. Like, how many millions of more people would have voted one way or the other in this last election cycle if the tone was better? Yeah. Well, maybe it's just me, but it just feels like a collective exhale when, particularly at the highest levels of kind of the political totem pole. But isn't that what leadership's about? You would think, right? Like, if we want to see, 250 million people who care about politics in this country change their attitude, then let the leadership start at the beginning and lead by example. And the term limits piece that you talked about, I think that's crucial. Just for a million reasons, and I won't go deep into those details because they're all obvious why I think term limits make sense. But this, if you don't care about coming back, it's amazing the things you can get done, right? And that was a reminder somebody gave me when I first got sworn into the House years ago. said, look, if you don't care about coming back, then just vote your conscience every time. Speak your conscience.
Yeah.
And to me, that is ultimately the aloe on sunburn that I think America's waiting for.
That's good. You told me about collaborating with Stacey Abrams.
Yeah.
Over the rural healthcare bill. And I wish our elected officials would do two things, certainly more than that, but these two things. One is, instead of it's all bad if it's from the other side or it's all good if it's from my side, be willing to have the more insightful, reflective discussion, which is, hey, somebody from the other side of the aisle came up with a pretty good idea. I think there's a couple things that as a conservative or as a liberal, I'd like to see changed. But you know what? That was a really good idea, and I want to give so-and-so credit for that. The second thing I wish they would do, and this speaks to me as a fiscal conservative, is anytime they propose legislation, they should start with, I am asking American taxpayers to pay for X, Y, or Z, right? Like they spin it
like
as
a preamble. That's
like a preamble.
Attached,
like
right.
Before you propose any legislation or back any legislation, you have to say, I am asking you, the American taxpayer, the American citizen, to pay for this, because that's ultimately what every bit of legislation is.
Yep. No, I think that's...
Except you had one piece of legislation that didn't cost the taxpayers any money. Was it the solar one? You wrote about it in the book. You said it didn't cost the taxpayers a dime.
Yeah. Several. That one specifically. The rural healthcare bill didn't cost anybody anything either. We raised $60 million for 57 rural hospitals overnight. Yeah. Because it was just a tax credit. And I think there's an opportunity to do this more. I talk about this briefly in the book about maybe one day we could give up to 5% of our federal tax income liability and give it to a charitable cause that we get to pick. Right? Obviously, we got to go through all the rules and regs. We don't want fraud and all that stuff to leak up. Yeah. But an opportunity to give, to start to exercise that muscle of giving, right? We learn that in our churches, right? It's better to give than receive. Once you may not feel like it, but once you do it, you feel what that feels like. What if we could give up to 5% and channel it towards how much more efficient would those dollars be? That's what I learned about the rural healthcare bill was, if somebody gave $5,000 to Evans Memorial Hospital in Claxton, Georgia, that $5,000, how much would you have to give the state government before it ended up as $5,000? I mean, $50,000? $100,000? Like, I don't know. Like
way more.
The bureaucratic creep in there of pulling out money to run the system. We can do a better job of that, I think, nationally.
That's awesome. All right, last question. I promise this time. So I think you've proven that you want to lead with integrity. You want to lead with the gospel. You want to be able to go home from work every night and be able to stand in front of your family, your wife of 23 years, soon to be 24, and your 3 kids, one of whom goes to Georgia, which is awesome. And know that you did what is right, not what is wrong. This is a podcast about being a good Samaritan. Unfortunately or fortunately, I'm not sure, doesn't seem like there's a better kind of environment right now to be a good Samaritan, walk across the road, serve somebody who's not like you, than across the political spectrum. So if you don't mind, speak to people of faith right now, because that's who our audience is. These are largely believers hearing stories of being good Samaritans. How do people of faith behave like good Samaritans in this nasty, dirty, messy paradigm called American politics?
Yeah, so I have a chapter about this, and I wrote it. This was the easiest chapter for me to write. Was it Faith, Love, and Politics?
Faith, Love, and Politics,
And it was the easiest one to write, but the hardest for me to actually want to include it because I just felt like it was going to, because I talk about Jesus, right? Like, there's no more polarizing name in the world, right? But us as believers realize it's the unifying force for us. But I talked about Jesus in a way to just, hey, let's go unpack the person and the life that he lived. And if he's a higher being to you, that's great, but that's somebody else to talk about on Sunday, not me. I think we as believers, we just got to go figure out how to act like Jesus, right? Like how do we really truly figure out how to love our neighbor every day? How do we put on display one conversation at a time, one relationship at a time, one election cycle at a time about how to don't give ourselves a hall pass to call somebody everything but a child of God, all in the pursuit of doing what, this one position. One of the eye-opening experiences for me during the debacle, the 10 weeks after the election, was the amount of social media feedback I got, right? If I'd go on national TV and I'd say the election wasn't rigged and boom, boom, I'd get in the car with the troopers and up would come 1,000 somethings from somewhere. And it blew my mind how many people, like I would click on their profile and it would be like, well, I'd read their tweet to me like, yeah, I can't believe you do this. You're a lying, cheating piece of blah, blah, blah. And it'd just be like, I can't believe they let this on Twitter. But then you click on their profile, it'd be like, you know, father of 3, mother of 4, Jesus follower, you know, Sunday school leader. It's like something's broken here. Either this is a bot or somebody's lost their way or they need to rewrite their profile.
Right.
I just think we can do a better job of following Jesus.
Yeah, that's good. You know, Batya Unger-Sargon left this podcast, Geoff, one of them, I think the first one that we did with her. We actually got her on to talk about the Israel-Palestine conflict, which was also very insightful in terms of how she viewed things and the history and all that. But she said, you know, why do she was speaking to evangelicals, I think, because maybe that's the political kind of angle on Christianity in the United States, which is unfortunate because there's way more evangelicals outside the U.S. than inside the U.S., our research shows. But she said, David, why do evangelicals let somebody else carry the torch of compassion in this country?
Yeah.
And I thought, you know what? That's it. Why can't our rallying cry be around compassion? Why is it around Republican or Democrat or you know, build a wall or all these crazy things, right? Like, why can't we be the leaders in the compassion delivery in this country?
Faith without works is pointless.
Yeah, there you go. How about that, Dan?
Boom, good way to end it.
I think we're okay with our first politician.
Yeah, I'm cool with it.
On Walking Through Samaria.
I like it.
A badge of honor.
Yeah, Geoff, this was a delight. Thank you so much for spending time with us. GOP 2.0, everybody. That's Geoff's book. It was just released last week, last Tuesday.
Yep.
So it's only 6 days old. It is out there. I hope I'm not biased as a fiscal conservative, but first of all, it definitely clarifies what happened in Georgia. So if any of our listeners are out there in Georgia, you need to get your hands on the book just for that. But I find it very insightful and frankly, very complimentary to the gospel. So congratulations on the book, and I hope it does really, really well.
Well, thanks for the opportunity and look forward to all the feedback.
Yeah. And go Dogs.
Go Dogs.
Well, that's it for today on the Walking Through Samaria podcast. It has been a treat to have Lieutenant Governor of the state of Georgia, Geoff Duncan, on. Thanks so much for being here. This is your host, David Hendrickson, with my co-host,
Dan Riveros.
So great to be with you all today. We'll talk to you next time on the Walking Through Samaria podcast.
See ya. For more content like this, visit us at givingcompany.com. Thank you for joining us, and we'll see you next time on Walking Through Samaria.